Zenth had always prided himself on being a logical creature. As a member of the Catharian diplomatic corps, he had encountered dozens of species across the galaxy, each with their own peculiarities and customs. His natural ability to remain calm under pressure had earned him recognition among his peers and several commendations from the High Council. Nothing in the universe had ever truly frightened him, until the day he was assigned to establish first contact with a species called humans. The briefing had been routine. Humans were a relatively young species, having only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last century. They came from a small blue planet called Earth, located in what they termed the Sol System. Initial long-range observations suggested they were bipedal mammals with a moderate level of technology and a complex social structure. Standard first contact protocols would apply. Zenth's ship, the diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge, dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol System on what humans called a Tuesday morning. The journey from Catharian space had taken 3 weeks, and Zenth had used the time to study every available piece of data about this new species. Their art seemed to focus heavily on conflict and struggle, which was concerning but not unprecedented. Many species went through aggressive phases during their development. What struck him as odd was the sheer variety of their cultural expressions. Most species the Catharians had encountered showed remarkable uniformity once they achieved spaceflight, shared languages, unified governments, common goals. Humans appeared to maintain hundreds of distinct cultures, languages, and political systems even after reaching the stars. It was chaotic and inefficient, but perhaps that was simply their way. The first response to their arrival came within hours. A small fleet of human vessels approached their position, weapons powered but not targeted, a clear sign of caution rather than aggression. Zenth appreciated their restraint. The lead vessel transmitted a message in surprisingly clear galactic standard, though with an unusual accent that suggested they had learned the language recently, and with great effort. Unknown vessel. This is Captain Sarah Chun of the United Earth Defense Force ship Defiance. You have entered sovereign human space. Please identify yourself and state your intentions. Zenth activated the communication array and responded with the standard diplomatic greeting he had used dozens of times before. Greetings, Captain Chun. I am Ambassador Zenth of the Catharian Diplomatic Corps. We come in peace, seeking to establish formal relations between our peoples according to Galactic Council protocols. There was a pause, longer than usual for such exchanges. When a human captain responded, Zenth detected something in her voice that he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't fear, exactly, nor was it aggression. It was something else entirely. Ambassador Zenth, your arrival is unexpected. We've been monitoring galactic communications for some time, but this is our first direct contact with an alien species. Permission granted to approach Earth. You'll be escorted to Luna Station for preliminary discussions. The escort proceeded without incident, giving Zenth his first close look at human technology. Their ships were crude compared to Catharian designs, relying on inefficient fusion drives and primitive alloy construction. What surprised him was how heavily armed they were. Every vessel in the escort carried enough firepower to level a small city. For a species supposedly at peace, they seemed remarkably well prepared for war. Luna Station was an impressive feat of engineering for such a young species. The massive orbital platform housed nearly 50,000 humans and served as their primary spaceport and defense installation. As the Harmony's Edge docked, Zenth found himself genuinely curious about these creatures. Their technology might be primitive, but their ambition was evident. The welcoming committee that greeted him was small, but carefully chosen. Captain Chun was there, along with a diplomat named Ambassador Rodriguez, a scientist called Dr. Kim, and 2 others whose roles weren't immediately clear, but who carried themselves like soldiers. They were all bipedal, as expected, with varying skin tones and facial features that suggested genetic diversity within their species. What caught Zenth's attention was their eyes, alert, calculating, constantly assessing their surroundings. Ambassador Zenth, Rodriguez stepped forward with what Zinth recognized as a formal greeting gesture. "Welcome to Luna Station. We're honored to meet our first galactic neighbor." The preliminary discussions went smoothly. Humans, it seemed, were eager to learn about the broader galactic community. They asked intelligent questions about trade, technology exchange, and cultural programs. Their curiosity was refreshing after dealing with species that often viewed contact as a mere formality. What puzzled Zinth was an undercurrent he kept detecting in their conversations, a tension that seemed to have nothing to do with their meeting. It was Dr. Kim who inadvertently provided the first clue. During a discussion about human scientific achievements, she mentioned their recent colonization efforts. "We've established settlements on 12 worlds so far," she said with obvious pride. "Not bad for a species that was confined to one planet just 80 years ago." Zinth was impressed. Most species took centuries to establish even a handful of colonies after achieving spaceflight. That's quite remarkable. You must have had very favorable conditions for expansion. Dr. Kim's expression darkened slightly. "Not exactly. We lost our first 3 colony ships to various hazards. The 4th colony was wiped out by a plague. 2 others fell to natural disasters. We learned to prepare for the worst and hope for the best." "Your species seems remarkably resilient," Zinth observed. "We have to be," Captain Shin interjected. "Earth isn't exactly a gentle mother." That evening, Zinth was given quarters on the station and access to human cultural databases. What he found there began to paint a disturbing picture. Human entertainment was dominated by stories of conflict, survival, and overcoming impossible odds. Their news broadcasts spoke casually of natural disasters that would be considered apocalyptic events on most worlds. Their history was an unbroken chain of wars, plagues, famines, and catastrophes. But what truly unsettled Zinth was how humans responded to these challenges. Where most species would retreat, adapt to their environment, or seek aid from others, humans seemed to charge headlong into danger with a determination that bordered on insanity. They had thrived in conditions that would have broken most civilized species. The next day brought a tour of the station's facilities. Zinth was shown their medical bay, where he learned that human medicine was focused primarily on trauma treatment and emergency surgery. Their engineering sections were designed with redundant systems and rapid repair capabilities. Even their civilian areas had emergency protocols that assumed regular catastrophic failures. "You seem to expect disaster at every turn," Zinth commented to his guide, a cheerful engineer named Martinez. "Not expect," Martinez replied. "Prepare for. Murphy's Law is a fundamental principle of human engineering. Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Usually at the worst possible time and in the most inconvenient way. So we plan accordingly." That afternoon, an incident occurred that would haunt Zinth's memories for the rest of his life. A massive solar flare erupted from Seoul, sending a wave of radiation toward the station. The warning came with barely minutes to spare, not enough time for evacuation, barely enough time to seek shelter. On any civilized world, this would have triggered panic. Emergency protocols would have been activated, and the population would have been moved to the safest possible locations to wait out the storm. What Zinth witnessed instead defied all logic and reason. The humans didn't panic. They didn't even seem particularly concerned. Instead, they moved with practiced efficiency to their emergency stations. The station's shields were reinforced, non-essential personnel were moved to shielded areas, and critical systems were secured. But rather than hunkering down to wait out the storm, teams of humans actually moved closer to the outer sections of the station. "What are they doing?" Zinth asked Captain Shun as they watched from the command center. "Maintenance teams," she replied calmly. "Solar flares can cause power fluctuations and system failures. Someone needs to be ready to make repairs if anything goes wrong." Zinth was aghast. "But the radiation levels in those areas will be lethal." "Not immediately. The teams are in radiation suits and will cycle out every 20 minutes. We've done this dozens of times." As Zinth watched in growing horror, he realized that this casual acceptance of mortal danger was not an aberration. It was normal human behavior. They weren't being brave or heroic. They were simply doing what needed to be done, regardless of the risk to themselves. The solar storm lasted 6 hours. During that time, Zenth observed human crew members voluntarily exposing themselves to potentially lethal radiation to keep the station functioning. They worked in shifts, monitoring each other's radiation exposure with the same casual attention they might give to their lunch schedules. When one team member's dosimeter indicated dangerous levels, they were pulled back and replaced without argument or hesitation. 3 times during the storm, critical systems failed and required immediate attention. Each time, humans suited up and walked directly into radiation that would have killed most galactic species within minutes. They repaired the systems, returned to safety, and went back to their normal duties as if nothing unusual had happened. When the storm finally passed, Zenth found himself shaking, not from fear of the radiation, but from the realization of what he had just witnessed. These humans had casually accepted risks that would have paralyzed most civilized species with terror. They had walked into deadly conditions not out of desperation or ignorance, but as a matter of routine. "Is this normal?" he asked Dr. Kim as the all-clear was given. "Solar storms? Sure, we get them every few months. This was actually a pretty mild one." Zenth stared at her, beginning to understand that his fundamental assumptions about this species were completely wrong. Humans didn't just survive in dangerous conditions, they thrived in them. They didn't avoid risk, they managed it. They didn't fear death. They simply refused to let it stop them from doing what needed to be done. That night, alone in his quarters, Zenth began writing his preliminary report to the diplomatic corps. How could he possibly convey what he had learned? How could he explain that humanity's greatest strength was their absolute refusal to be stopped by anything, including their own mortality? As he wrote, Zenth found himself wondering what would happen if this species ever decided that something needed to be done on a galactic scale. What would they do if they encountered a threat that endangered not just themselves, but others? Would they charge into that danger with the same casual determination he had witnessed today? The thought sent a chill through his crystalline nervous system. For the first time in his long diplomatic career, Zenth had encountered something that truly frightened him. Not the humans themselves, but their potential. They were a species that had been forged in the crucible of a hostile world, shaped by constant danger into something that simply could not be stopped. And they had just gained access to the galaxy. 3 weeks had passed since the solar storm incident, and Zenth found himself settling into a routine aboard Luna Station. His initial shock at human behavior had given way to a deeper curiosity about their nature. The diplomatic corps had granted him extended time to study these fascinating creatures, and every day brought new revelations that challenged everything he thought he knew about civilized species. The humans had been remarkably accommodating, providing him with access to their historical archives, cultural databases, and even allowing him to observe their daily operations. What he discovered painted a picture of a species that had not merely survived on their hostile world, but had actively sought out greater challenges. Dr. Kim had become his unofficial guide to human psychology, a role she seemed to enjoy despite her busy schedule. "You have to understand, Ambassador," she explained as they walked through the station's hydroponics bay, "Earth never gave us a choice about being tough. Our planet tried to kill us every single day." Zenth observed the carefully tended plants growing under artificial sunlight. Even their food production showed signs of their survival mentality. Multiple redundant systems, drought-resistant crops, and backup growing methods in case the primary systems failed. But surely once you developed technology, conditions became more manageable. Dr. Kim laughed, a sound that Zenth was learning meant humans found something amusing rather than threatening. Technology just gave us better tools to get ourselves into more dangerous situations. Look at our space program. We've been strapping ourselves to controlled explosions and hurling ourselves into the void for over 2 centuries. This was something that particularly puzzled Zenth. Most species developed space travel gradually, with extensive safety protocols and careful risk assessment. Humans appear to have achieved spaceflight through what could only be described as controlled recklessness. Their early space missions had failure rates that would have ended most species' expansion efforts permanently. Your early space program had a fatality rate of nearly 12%, Zenth noted, consulting his datapad. That's catastrophically high by galactic standards. How did your species continue with such losses? Because the alternative was staying stuck on one planet, Dr. Kim replied matter-of-factly. We always knew some of us wouldn't make it. The ones who did carried on for the ones who didn't. That afternoon brought an event that would further reshape Zenth's understanding of humanity. A distress signal was detected from the outer system. A human research vessel had suffered critical damage while studying the gas giant Jupiter's radiation-soaked moons. The ship was losing life support, and its crew of 8 was in immediate danger. Zenth watched from the command center as the humans organized their response. By galactic standards, it was a hopeless situation. The damaged vessel was too far away for a conventional rescue, positioned in a radiation field that would disable most rescue ships. Standard protocol would be to attempt communication and provide what assistance was possible, but the crew would likely be lost. The humans, however, saw the situation differently. We can reach them, Captain Chun announced after reviewing the tactical display. It'll require using the Aurora and pushing her engines past Redline, but we can get there in time. The radiation will overwhelm our shields, her tactical officer pointed out. The crew would receive potentially lethal doses. Potentially, Chun agreed. But the research team will definitely die if we don't try. All volunteers for the rescue mission step forward. Zenth watched in amazement as every single person in the command center stepped forward. Not some of them, all of them. They weren't being ordered to volunteer. They were choosing to risk their lives for 8 people they might not even know personally. Chun selected a crew of 6 for the rescue mission, and Zenth found himself requesting permission to observe. I want to understand how your species approaches such situations, he explained. The journey to the outer system aboard the Aurora was unlike anything in Zenth's experience. The human crew pushed their ship beyond all safe operating parameters, coaxing more speed and power from systems that were never designed for such stress. They worked with a coordination that spoke of years of training and an absolute trust in each other's abilities. Why are you doing this? Zenth asked the mission commander, Lieutenant Torres. The statistical probability of success is less than 40%. Torres glanced at him while monitoring the engine readouts. Because they're humans, and we don't leave humans behind. It's not about statistics, Ambassador. It's about who we are. As they approached the damaged research vessel, the radiation levels began climbing to dangerous levels. The Aurora's shields held, but barely, and Zenth could see the crew monitoring their radiation exposure with the same casual attention he had witnessed during the solar storm. The rescue itself was a masterpiece of improvised engineering and raw determination. The research ship was trapped in a decaying orbit around one of Jupiter's moons, its engines dead and life support failing. The Aurora couldn't dock safely, so the humans improvised a solution that defied several laws of physics and common sense. They used the Aurora's tractor beam to stabilize the research vessel while simultaneously deploying a hardsuit team to manually transfer the stranded crew. The operation required split-second timing and perfect coordination between the ships, all while both vessels were being bombarded with radiation that was slowly degrading their systems. Zenth watched humans in hardsuits leap across open space between the two ships, carrying their unconscious or injured colleagues to safety. When the tractor beam began failing due to radiation damage, they used the Aurora's maneuvering thrusters to physically nudge the research ship into a more stable position, risking collision and destruction for both vessels. The entire operation took 3 hours. When it was over, all 8 members of the research team had been successfully rescued, though 2 required immediate medical attention for radiation exposure. The Aurora's crew had absorbed dangerous but non-lethal radiation doses, and their ship would require extensive repairs. As they began the journey back to Luna Station, Zenth found himself struggling to process what he had witnessed. "You risked 14 lives to save 8, he said to Lieutenant Torres. "By any logical calculation, that was an inefficient use of resources." Torres looked at him with an expression Zenth was learning to recognize as uniquely human, a mixture of amusement and mild pity for someone who didn't understand something obvious. "Ambassador, humans aren't resources. They're people. We don't do cost-benefit analysis on people's lives." That statement haunted Zenth for the remainder of the journey. In galactic society, difficult decisions were always made based on logical analysis and statistical outcomes. Resources, including lives, were allocated where they could do the most good. The human refusal to apply such logic to their own species was both alien and terrifying. Upon their return to Luna Station, Zenth was granted access to more detailed historical records. What he found there painted an even more disturbing picture of humanity's nature. Their history was filled with similar incidents. Individuals and small groups risking everything to save others, often with no hope of reward or recognition. There was the story of Harriet Tubman, who repeatedly returned to slave territory to lead others to freedom despite a massive bounty on her head. The account of Irina Sendler, who smuggled thousands of children out of the Warsaw Ghetto at the risk of her own life. The tale of Stanislav Petrov, who single-handedly prevented nuclear war by refusing to report what appeared to be an incoming missile strike. But it wasn't just individuals. Entire human societies had repeatedly chosen to sacrifice for others, even for their enemies. After devastating wars, they had rebuilt their former opponents' countries. They had shared medical advances that could have been kept as strategic advantages. They had repeatedly chosen cooperation over domination, even when domination would have been easier. Your species seems to have a fundamental inability to act in its own self-interest, Zenth observed to Dr. Kim during one of their discussions. "That's not quite right," she corrected. "We do act in our self-interest. It's just that we have a very broad definition of self. When we see other humans in danger, we don't see strangers, we see ourselves. When we see suffering that we could prevent, preventing it becomes part of our self-interest." Zenth was beginning to understand that this was the key to human psychology. Most species developed intelligence as a survival trait, using it to outcompete others and secure resources for their own group. Humans had developed something different, a form of intelligence that compelled them to expand their definition of us until it included virtually everyone. This realization led to another disturbing thought. If humans were willing to risk everything for other humans, what would they do if they encountered threats to other species? Would they apply the same reckless determination to protecting aliens as they did to protecting their own kind? The answer came sooner than expected. A communication from the galactic frontier brought news of a developing crisis. The Zelani system, home to a peaceful agricultural species, was under attack by the Scorth Confederation, a militaristic empire that had been expanding aggressively for decades. The Zelani had no military to speak of and were requesting aid from any member of the Galactic Council. The response from most species was predictable. They expressed sympathy, offered economic assistance, and promised to bring the matter before the Council for formal consideration. It was all very civilized and entirely inadequate. By the time the Council reached a decision and organized a response, the Zelani would likely be extinct. The human response was different. "We're going to help them," Captain Shin announced during an emergency briefing. "The Scorth have 12 ships in the Zelani system. We can get there with 8 vessels if we leave within 6 hours." "Captain," Ambassador Rodriguez pointed out, "humanity isn't even a member of the Galactic Council yet. We have no obligation to intervene in this conflict." "We have every obligation," Shin replied. "People are dying. That's all the obligation we need." Zenth watched in fascination as the humans organized their response. They didn't debate the wisdom of intervention or calculate the potential costs to their own species. They simply accepted that innocent beings were in danger and that they had the power to help. Everything else was secondary. Within 4 hours, a human battle group was departing Luna Station for the Zilani system. It was a force that represented nearly half of Earth's total military capability, being deployed to protect a species they had never met in a star system most humans couldn't even pronounce. Why? Zenth asked Dr. Kim as they watched the ships disappear into hyperspace. Why would your species risk so much for strangers? Dr. Kim was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars where the battle group had vanished. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that Zenth had never heard before. Because someone has to, Ambassador. Because there are monsters in the dark, and someone has to stand between them and the innocent. Because if we don't, who will? As Zenth returned to his quarters that night, he found himself terrified in a way he had never experienced before. He was beginning to understand what humans truly were, and the implications were staggering. They weren't just another species that had achieved spaceflight. They were something entirely new in galactic history, a species that had weaponized compassion and turned altruism into a force of nature. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when humanity decided that something needed to be done, and Zenth suspected that nothing would ever be the same again. The wait for news from the Zilani system stretched into days, then weeks. During this time, Zenth found himself with unprecedented access to human military planning and strategy sessions. What he witnessed there challenged every assumption about warfare and conflict that his diplomatic training had instilled in him. Most galactic species approached warfare as an extension of politics, a tool to be used when negotiation failed, with clear objectives and acceptable losses calculated in advance. Human military doctrine was fundamentally different. They planned not just for victory, but for what came after victory. Their strategy sessions included discussions of post-conflict reconstruction, civilian protection protocols, and long-term stability measures. You plan as if you intend to remain in the Zilani system indefinitely, Zenth observed during one such session. General Martinez, the grizzled commander overseeing the operation, looked up from the tactical displays. We plan as if we're responsible for what happens next, Ambassador. Breaking something is easy. Fixing it afterward is the hard part. This attitude permeated every aspect of human military thinking. Their weapons were designed to minimize civilian casualties, even at the cost of reduced effectiveness against military targets. Their tactics prioritized the protection of non-combatants over tactical advantage. They had even developed protocols for providing humanitarian aid to enemy soldiers who were wounded or captured. This seems inefficient, Zenth commented. Surely your primary objective should be defeating the Scoreth as quickly as possible. Our primary objective, Martinez corrected, is making sure the Zilani survive as a people and a culture. Defeating the Scoreth is just one step in that process. The first reports from the Zilani system arrived 3 weeks after the battle group's departure. The news was both encouraging and deeply unsettling. The human fleet had engaged the Scoreth vessels in a series of running battles across the outer planets, using tactics that the enemy clearly hadn't anticipated. Rather than seeking a decisive fleet engagement, the humans had adopted a strategy of constant harassment and attrition. They attacked Scoreth supply lines, disabled their communications networks, and struck at their forward bases with surgical precision. The Scoreth found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to stand still long enough for a proper battle. But what truly shocked the galactic community was what happened next. When Scoreth vessels were disabled rather than destroyed, human rescue teams moved in to recover survivors. Captured Scoreth soldiers were provided with medical care and proper treatment according to interstellar law. Human casualties were evacuated alongside enemy wounded when medical facilities were overwhelmed. They're treating their enemies better than most species treat their allies, observed Consul Thex during a Galactic Council session that Zenth attended via subspace communication. The Scoreth response to this unprecedented behavior was confused and increasingly desperate. They had built their empire on intimidation and overwhelming force, expecting their enemies to either flee or fight to the death. Humans didn't either. They fought with determination, but also with restraint, showing mercy that the Scoreth had never encountered before. After 6 weeks of continuous conflict, something unprecedented happened. A Scoreth battle group surrendered to the humans without firing a shot. The commanding officer, Admiral Vextar, transmitted a message that would be studied by xenopsychologists for generations to come. Human vessels. This is Admiral Vextar of the Scoreth Third Fleet. We wish to discuss terms. Your conduct in this conflict has been confusing. We do not understand your methods or your motivations. We request permission to negotiate. Captain Chin's response was broadcast across the galaxy. Admiral Vextar, you are granted safe passage to the neutral station at Zalani 4. We will discuss not just an end to hostilities, but how we can ensure this never happens again. The negotiations that followed became a landmark in interstellar diplomacy. The humans didn't demand the Scoreth's unconditional surrender or the dismantling of their empire. Instead, they focused on addressing the underlying causes of Scoreth aggression, resource scarcity, territorial pressure, and a military culture that had no outlet other than conquest. Zenth watched the proceedings with growing amazement as human negotiators offered technological assistance, trade agreements, and even military cooperation to their former enemies. The Scoreth delegation seemed as baffled as he was. "Why do you offer us aid after we attack your allies?" asked General Korthak, the Scoreth military representative. Ambassador Rodriguez answered with the same matter-of-fact tone that Zenth had heard so often from humans. "Because the alternative is fighting this war again in 10 years when your resource problems force you to expand again. We'd rather solve the problem than treat the symptoms." The final agreement was unlike anything in galactic history. The Scoreth would withdraw from Zalani space and cease all aggressive expansion. In return, humanity would provide technological assistance, facilitate trade relationships with other species, and establish joint military exercises to redirect Scoreth martial culture toward defensive rather than offensive purposes. But the most shocking provision was humanity's offer to extend their protection to any species threatened by aggression, regardless of their ability to reciprocate. They were essentially establishing themselves as galactic peacekeepers, taking on responsibilities that no single species had ever attempted to shoulder. "You realize what you're committing to?" Zenth asked Ambassador Rodriguez during a private meeting after the agreements were signed. "You're making yourselves responsible for the safety of billions of beings across dozens of star systems." Rodriguez nodded calmly. "Someone has to. The Council means well, but they're too slow to respond to emergencies. By the time they organize a response, entire civilizations can be wiped out. But the cost to your own species will be enormous. Your military will be stretched across the galaxy. Your economy will be strained supporting all these commitments. Your people will die in conflicts that have nothing to do with Earth security." "Yes," Rodriguez agreed. "They will. And they'll do it anyway because it's the right thing to do." This conversation marked a turning point in Zenth's understanding of humanity. He had initially been puzzled by their willingness to risk everything for strangers. Then he had been impressed by their tactical abilities and strategic thinking. Now he was beginning to grasp the true scope of what they represented. Humans weren't just another species that had achieved spaceflight. They were a fundamental change in the nature of galactic civilization. For millennia, interstellar relations have been based on careful calculation of costs and benefits, with each species looking out primarily for its own interests. The Galactic Council existed to mediate disputes and prevent major conflicts, but it was essentially a forum for managed selfishness. Humanity had introduced something entirely new: unconditional altruism backed by overwhelming determination. They had made themselves responsible for problems that weren't their fault, committed to protecting people they had never met, and assumed burdens that would have crushed most species. The implications were staggering. If humans were willing to fight and die for alien species, what would they do when faced with threats to the galaxy itself? How would they respond to challenges that endangered not just individual worlds or species, but the entire structure of interstellar civilization? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Deep space monitoring stations detected something approaching from the galactic rim, a massive fleet of unknown vessels moving toward inhabited space. Initial analysis suggested a force of unprecedented size and technological capability, easily capable of overwhelming any known military. The discovery triggered emergency sessions of the Galactic Council, but the response was predictably slow and fractured. Some species wanted to attempt communication with the approaching fleet. Others advocated for immediate evacuation of frontier worlds. A few suggested that resistance was hopeless and that terms of surrender should be prepared in advance. The human response was characteristically direct. Within hours of receiving the intelligence reports, Earth's entire military was mobilizing. Not just their active forces, but their reserve. What possible purpose does feudal resistance serve? Chen's answer was simple and devastating. Because while we're fighting, you'll have time to run. And because someone needs to show these invaders that this galaxy doesn't surrender without a fight. The human battle plan was insane by any rational standard. They intended to engage a vastly superior enemy force with the knowledge that they could not win, buying time for other species to escape or prepare their own defenses. They were essentially volunteering for extinction to give others a chance at survival. But as Zenth watched the preparations unfold, he realized that humans had never fought a war they expected to lose. Their history was filled with impossible victories achieved through determination, innovation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. They had survived ice ages, plagues, natural disasters, and their own worst instincts. They had turned a hostile world into a garden and reached for the stars with primitive technology and boundless ambition. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to win the impossible war that was coming. As human fleets departed for the galactic rim to meet the approaching threat, Zenth found himself drafting what would likely be his final report to the diplomatic corps. How could he possibly convey what he had learned about humanity? How could he explain that these strange, reckless creatures might be the galaxy's only hope? In the end, he wrote a single sentence that captured everything he had discovered. Humanity is what happens when evolution decides that the universe needs a species too stubborn to know when it's beaten. The invasion fleet was 3 days away from the first inhabited systems. Admiral Chen's forces were moving to intercept. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, the fate of galactic civilization hung in the balance. Zenth found himself doing something he had never done before in his long diplomatic career. He was praying to whatever gods might be listening that humanity's impossible determination would somehow be enough to save them all. The first engagement between human forces and the invasion fleet occurred at the edge of the Proxima Nebula, 14 light-years from the nearest inhabited system. Zenth watched the battle unfold through long-range sensors aboard Luna Station. His crystalline form rigid with tension as tactical displays showed the impossible odds humanity faced. The invasion fleet was massive beyond comprehension. Over 3,000 vessels of unknown configuration, each one larger than Earth's heaviest battleships. Their technology appeared to be centuries ahead of anything in known space, with energy weapons that could burn through planetary shields and armor that seemed to absorb directed fire without effect. Admiral Chen's fleet numbered just over 400 ships, a motley collection of military vessels, converted civilian craft, and hastily retrofitted cargo haulers. By every rational calculation, they should have been obliterated in the opening minutes of the battle. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The humans didn't fight the way the invaders expected. Rather than forming traditional battle lines or attempting coordinated fleet actions, they broke into small groups that swarmed around the enemy vessels like angry insects. They used the nebula's electromagnetic interference to mask their movements, appearing from sensor shadows to strike at vulnerable points before vanishing back into the cosmic dust. They're not trying to destroy the enemy's ships, observed Dr. Kim as she analyzed the tactical data. They're trying to disable specific systems. Zenth watched in fascination as human strike teams focused their attacks on what appeared to be communication arrays, weapon targeting systems, and propulsion units. They weren't attempting to win through brute force. They were systematically degrading the enemy's ability to coordinate and fight effectively. The invasion fleet responded with increasing frustration, their formations breaking apart as individual ships found themselves isolated and under constant harassment. Their superior weapons were useless if they couldn't target their enemies, and their advanced shields were irrelevant when humans were striking at exposed sensor arrays and engine nacelles. But the cost was horrific. Human ships died by the dozens, overwhelmed by enemy fire or destroyed in ramming attacks when their weapons proved insufficient. Admiral Chen's flagship, the Defiance, was one of the first casualties, taking a direct hit from an enemy dreadnought while covering the retreat of damaged vessels. The loss of their commander should have spelled the end of human resistance. Instead, something even more remarkable occurred. Rather than falling apart without central command, the human fleet seemed to become more dangerous. Individual ship captains began taking initiative, coordinating spontaneous attacks with nearby vessels, and adapting their tactics in real time. "They're not following any recognizable command structure," reported the station's tactical officer. "Each ship seems to be operating independently, but they're still working together somehow." Zenth was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic warfare. Most species required rigid hierarchy and central command to function effectively in battle. Humans, it seemed, could operate as a distributed intelligence, each unit making decisions based on local conditions while somehow maintaining overall coherence. The pattern continued for 3 days and nights. The human fleet dwindled steadily. 400 ships became 300, then 200, then barely 100 survivors still able to fight. But the invasion fleet was suffering as well, not from destruction, but from cumulative damage that left ships isolated and unable to coordinate with their fellows. On the 4th day, Captain Sarah Martinez of the destroyer Indomitable transmitted a message that would become legend. "All ships, this is Martinez. We've identified their command vessel, the big one with the crystalline superstructure. If we can take it out, their whole fleet might collapse. I'm going to need volunteers for a one-way trip." Every remaining human ship responded immediately. Not some of them, all of them. 137 vessels turned toward the enemy command ship in a coordinated suicide run, their crews knowing they would not survive, but determined to strike a blow that might save the galaxy. What followed was the most desperate and heroic action in recorded history. The remaining human ships fought their way through layers of enemy vessels, losing dozens of craft to defensive fire, but never wavering from their objective. They used their own destruction as weapons, ramming damaged ships into enemy vessels or detonating their reactors at point-blank range. The Indomitable was the last ship to reach the enemy command vessel. Her hull breached in a dozen places, and her crew dying from radiation exposure. She nonetheless managed to penetrate the massive ship's defenses and detonate her entire armament inside its central hull. The explosion that followed was visible across 3 star systems. With their command ship destroyed and their coordination network shattered, the invasion fleet began to fragment. Some vessels attempted to continue the assault independently, but without central coordination, they were vulnerable to the defensive forces that other species had finally managed to organize. Others simply withdrew back toward the galactic rim, apparently having lost all interest in conquest without their commanders to drive them forward. The immediate threat was over, but at a cost that staggered the galactic community. Humanity's entire military had been effectively wiped out. Of the 400 ships that had engaged the invasion fleet, fewer than a dozen had survived, and those were too damaged to pose any threat to anyone. Earth itself lay defenseless, its orbital platforms destroyed, and its population centers protected by nothing more than obsolete defensive satellites. If any species had wanted to conquer or destroy humanity, This would have been the perfect opportunity. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. Within days of the battle's end, ships began arriving in the Sol system. Not human vessels, but alien craft from dozens of different species. They came bearing supplies, medical aid, and offers of protection. The Zalani, whom humanity had saved from the Scorith, sent their entire merchant fleet loaded with food and raw materials. Former enemies like the Scorith themselves dispatched military vessels to help defend Earth against any remaining threats. "We are in your debt," declared Admiral Vextar in a message broadcast from his flagship as it took position alongside the wreckage of Luna Station. "You saved us from our own aggression. Now we will save you from the consequences of your heroism." The Galactic Council voted unanimously to grant humanity full membership with all attendant rights and privileges. More importantly, they established the Humanity Memorial Fund to assist in rebuilding Earth's defenses and honoring the sacrifice that had saved galactic civilization. But as Zenth watched alien ships working alongside human survivors to repair the damage, he realized that something fundamental had changed in the galaxy. Humanity's sacrifice had done more than defeat an invasion fleet. It had shattered the old paradigms of interstellar relations. For millennia, galactic civilization had been based on careful calculation of mutual benefit. Species cooperated when it served their interests and withdrew when it didn't. The concept of self-sacrifice for others was intellectually understood but rarely practiced on any meaningful scale. Humanity had changed that forever. They had shown that intelligence could evolve beyond mere survival instinct, that a species could choose to value the lives of strangers more than their own safety. They had proven that sometimes the most logical action was to act without logic, to refuse the rational choice in favor of the right choice. The influence of human thinking began spreading through galactic society like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Other species started questioning their own assumptions about acceptable risk and moral obligation. The Catharian Diplomatic Corps, Zenth's own organization, began developing new protocols based on human concepts of unconditional aid and protection of the innocent. "You've changed us all," Zenth told Dr. Kim during one of their conversations as Luna Station was being rebuilt. "Humanity has introduced concepts that most species had never seriously considered. The galaxy is becoming more like you." Dr. Kim smiled, though Zenth detected sadness in her expression. "Maybe that's what we were supposed to do. Maybe that's why the universe made us the way we are, stubborn and protective and unable to mind our own business when people are in trouble." 6 months after the invasion, Zenth completed his final report to the Diplomatic Corps. It ran to over 300 pages, but the conclusion was simple. Humanity represented the next stage in the evolution of galactic civilization. They were a species that had transcended the basic survival instincts that drove most intelligent life, developing instead a moral imperative that compelled them to protect others regardless of the cost to themselves. The implications were staggering. If humanity's influence continued to spread, it could transform interstellar society into something unprecedented, a truly cooperative civilization based on shared responsibility rather than mutual exploitation. But Zenth had also learned something that filled him with a different kind of awe. The qualities that made humans so remarkable, their compassion, their determination, their refusal to accept impossible odds, weren't unique to them. These traits existed in every species, buried beneath layers of evolutionary pragmatism and social conditioning. Humanity's greatest achievement wasn't their technology or their military prowess. It was their demonstration that intelligence could choose to be better than its origins, that any species could decide to value others as much as themselves. As Zenth prepared to return to Catharian space, he found himself looking forward to the future for the first time in his long career. The galaxy had always been a dangerous place, full of competing interests and inevitable conflicts. But now there was something new in the cosmic equation, a species that had chosen to make themselves responsible for everyone else's safety, and in doing so had inspired others to make similar choices. The universe was about to become a much more interesting place. On his final night aboard Luna Station, Zen stood in the observation deck watching Earth turn slowly below. The blue planet looked peaceful from this distance, its storms and conflicts invisible against the vast backdrop of space. But Zenth knew that this small world had produced something remarkable, a species that looked at the darkness between the stars and decided to become the light. Somewhere in that darkness, the remnants of the invasion fleet were still retreating toward the galactic rim. Other threats would emerge eventually, they always did. But for the first time in galactic history, there was a species standing watch, ready to charge into impossible odds to protect strangers they had never met. And, increasingly, they wouldn't be standing alone. As Zenth returned to his quarters to prepare for departure, he reflected on the title he would give his final report. I discovered true terror while standing among humans. It wasn't the terror of violence or destruction that had shaken him to his core. It was the terror of witnessing a species that had evolved beyond the basic selfishness that drove most intelligent life. Humans had shown the galaxy what it meant to be truly civilized, and that Zenth realized was the most terrifying and wonderful discovery of all. The future stretched ahead, uncertain, but no longer hopeless. Whatever challenges awaited galactic civilization, they would face them with humanity, standing guard, stubborn, determined, and absolutely unwilling to let anyone face the darkness alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough to see them all through to whatever came next.